Most people who watched Tyler Henry on television saw a calm young man with a notebook, sitting across from celebrities and delivering messages that left grown adults in tears. What they didn't see was the boy who had spent years being called dangerous by his own community, the teenager who pushed away the person he loved most because he already knew what was coming, the young man who went into emergency brain surgery before his career had even properly started, and the son who discovered that the woman his mother had called grandmother her entire life had been convicted of torture and murder. The fame was real. The waiting list of over 175,000 people wanting readings was real. But so was everything underneath it, and that part of the story is what almost nobody ever tells. Tyler Henry Colowin grew up as an only child in Hanford, California, where the San Joaquin Valley stretched flat and unhurried around a town that moved at the pace of small-town routine. His parents, Teresa and David Colowin, raised him in what looked from the outside like an ordinary household, and for the first decade of his life, ordinary is exactly what it was. School days, family dinners, the slow accumulation of a childhood that had nothing yet to distinguish it from any other. None of that survived his 10th year. One morning, without any warning and without any explanation he could point to, a certainty settled into Tyler's mind that his grandmother was going to die. Not a fear, not a bad dream he'd half remembered on waking, but a knowledge that sat in him fully formed and refused to move. He told his mother, Teresa. She assumed he was confused, perhaps anxious about something he couldn't name, and she tried to move him past it. Then the phone rang, and Tyler's father delivered the news that his grandmother had just collapsed and died. That moment didn't feel like the beginning of a gift. The terror of being right about something that terrible. At 10 years old, without any framework for understanding why his mind had produced that knowledge, stayed with Tyler long after the grief had settled, and the impressions kept arriving. Over the years that followed, he would meet someone and sense emotions that didn't belong to the present moment. Grief from decades back, love that had ended in death, the particular weight of a loss nobody in the room had brought up. Details about people's deceased relatives surfaced in his mind with a specificity he couldn't explain away. For a while, he carried it quietly, the way you hold something breakable in a crowded room, careful and constant. By his early teenage years, the secret had already escaped him, and word had spread through Hanford the way things always spread in small towns, not through announcements, but through whispers that eventually became neighborhood fact. What nobody expected was how the community would respond. Growing up in a conservative Christian environment meant that the idea of communicating with the dead didn't sit in neutral territory. Some people called it a spiritual gift, others called it something darker, and a few said openly that what Tyler experienced had no business being experienced at all. The result was a teenage life built around isolation in a way that went beyond ordinary adolescent loneliness. Classmates avoided him in hallways, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of something they couldn't quite categorize. Others mocked him directly. The psychic medium, Tyler Henry, who would later sit across from Hollywood celebrities and leave them visibly shaken, spent his middle school and high school years navigating rumors, skepticism, and a kind of social exile that followed him from one year to the next. And that's when Terry entered his life. During those same difficult years, Tyler formed a friendship with a boy named Terry that quickly grew into something that teenage language barely covers. Tyler later described Terry as his first love, and the way he talked about that period carried the particular texture of a feeling that never fully resolved. The two spent hours together in the way that teenagers discovering closeness for the first time do, sharing conversations that felt more honest than anything else available to them. None of that mattered once Tyler began sensing something he didn't want to know. A strong impression settled over him that Terry's childhood brain cancer, which had gone into remission, was going to come back. The feeling arrived with the same certainty as everything else he'd experienced since his grandmother's death, and it was unbearable. So Tyler did what the premonition pushed him toward. He started pulling away. Years later, he admitted this with a directness that took real courage to put into words. Distancing himself from Terry had been a way of trying to survive something he believed was already decided. What he hadn't accounted for was what survival without Terry would actually feel like. The cancer returned. Terry died before reaching adulthood. The grief hit Tyler hard, but the guilt proved heavier than the loss itself, and for years he returned to the question of whether he had made the right choice. The answer he eventually arrived at was that there hadn't been a right choice available. There was only what he'd done, and the cost of it, and the knowledge that his ability didn't protect the people he loved from anything. It just made him aware of what was coming while there was still time to be afraid. By 16, Tyler was giving readings regularly to people in his community, and by 17 and 18, the demand had grown far past Hanford and reached into Southern California, where the entertainment industry functions as a permanent search for exactly the kind of story Tyler represented. The turning point that pushed him into national visibility came through an appearance on Keeping Up with the Kardashians, where he sat with family members and connected them with memories of their late father, Robert Kardashian Sr., who had died years earlier. That segment spread across the internet fast, and suddenly, Tyler Henry wasn't just a local curiosity. The E! Network moved quickly, and Hollywood Medium with Tyler Henry premiered when he was 19 years old, placing a teenager at the center of one of the most talked-about paranormal series on American television. Celebrities lined up for readings. Some arrived skeptical and left in tears. During one session, Tyler warned Megan Fox about serious struggles in her relationship with Brian Austin Green. In another deeply emotional reading, Jaleel White was brought face-to-face with memories of his former Family Matters co-star, Michelle Thomas, who had died young. Those moments spread widely and built Tyler's reputation with a speed that was almost difficult to follow. After the first season aired, the waiting list for private readings climbed past 175,000 people, and that number kept growing. From the outside, the trajectory looked like pure success. A teenager who had been mocked and avoided in school was now one of the most recognizable figures in American paranormal entertainment, with a career that showed no signs of slowing. But here's the thing about fame at 19, when your job involves sitting across from people carrying the heaviest grief of their lives, the emotional weight of that work accumulated faster than most people understood from watching the show. Every reading required Tyler to manage the reactions of someone who might be crying, or frozen, or visibly fighting the urge to believe something they'd spent years telling themselves was impossible. At the same time, he had to remain composed enough to interpret the impressions arriving in his own mind and translate them into something that landed clearly for the person across from him. Day after day, season after season, that combination of emotional labor and constant public scrutiny built a pressure that didn't have anywhere obvious to release. The skeptics arrived quickly and stayed. Critics examined his readings closely and pointed to cold reading, the psychological technique of delivering statements that feel precise to people already in emotionally open states. Others argued that the television environment itself made skepticism harder to sustain, that grief softened judgment in ways the camera didn't always capture. Tyler never dismissed that criticism as irrelevant. He had always understood that the work he did occupied territory most people found genuinely impossible to evaluate cleanly, and that criticism was part of the price of working in that territory publicly. What caught him off guard was how personal and persistent it became. Every prediction was cataloged, every detail was analyzed, and entire online communities dedicated themselves specifically to building cases against him. None of that ended his career, but it changed the texture of his daily life in ways that didn't soften with time. And then came the discovery that shook his family in a way that no reading had ever prepared him for. For most of his life, Tyler believed his mother Teresa had a clear personal history, that the woman she called her mother was a woman named Stella Gordy Nestle, and that Teresa was her biological daughter. A home DNA test dismantled that belief completely. The woman who had raised Teresa turned out to have no biological connection to her at all. What the investigation that followed uncovered was genuinely dark. Stella Nestle had allegedly taken Teresa from a hospital shortly after her birth, falsified the records, and raised her under a fabricated identity for decades. None of that would have been shocking enough on its own, but Nestle's own history carried something worse. She had been convicted of the torture and murder of 2 victims and sentenced to multiple life terms in prison. An entire foundational layer of Teresa's identity had been built on a lie that nobody in the family had known to question, and it had held for decades without anyone looking at it directly. The experience landed on Tyler with a particular kind of weight. Here was a man whose entire public identity rested on the idea that he could reach across the boundary between the living and the dead, connecting people to relatives they had lost, delivering the answers that grief had made impossible to find through ordinary means. And now he stood in exactly the position of the people who came to him, searching for information about someone he had lost, hoping that whatever it was he did in readings might deliver something. Instead, He acknowledged openly that he never received any clear spiritual connection to the biological grandmother, who had died years before the family even knew she existed. Whatever his ability was, it didn't operate on demand. It didn't arrive when he needed it most for himself, and the painful irony of that wasn't lost on him. Tyler's health had been fragile since before any of this started. Born prematurely, he had a brain cyst identified early in his life, a condition that initially seemed manageable and eventually became dangerous. Shortly after turning 18, severe headaches arrived that escalated into something he described as the worst pain he had ever experienced. Doctors confirmed hydrocephalus, fluid building up inside his brain and creating pressure that required immediate surgical intervention. Emergency brain surgery followed, performed on a teenager whose career had barely started, whose television fame was still months away, whose future was entirely unclear. The surgery succeeded, and recovery came faster than doctors initially expected. But what remained was the understanding that his health might never be fully stable. The lung collapse came years later, arriving without warning just before the global pandemic began. Severe air leaks made reinflating the lung extraordinarily difficult, and weeks of hospitalization followed. Tyler later admitted the experience felt like another genuine encounter with not surviving. A possible early COVID infection may have contributed to the damage, though the exact cause stayed uncertain. And then, years after the lung emergency, doctors found a tumor near the center of his brain. Brain surgery was required again, the same kind of procedure that had saved him at 18, now necessary a second time, with a more fully constructed life resting on the outcome and a much larger audience watching from a distance. Through all of it, the surgeries and the weeks of recovery and the tours that had to be postponed while he healed, Tyler came back to the work. He said more than once, plainly and without dramatizing it, that performing live readings could put his health at risk. He said it as a fact he had made peace with, rather than a sacrifice he wanted credit for. The people sitting across from him were carrying grief that had no place to go, love with no remaining address, losses that years hadn't made smaller. The possibility of giving them something real, a detail that landed, a moment of recognition, a feeling that the person they lost hadn't entirely disappeared, was reason enough to keep returning, regardless of what returning cost him physically. Tyler Henry's public story is usually told as a success story, a teenager with an unusual ability who became one of the most recognized psychic mediums in America before he was old enough to have earned a decade of adult experience. But when you look at the full picture, the childhood premonition that started everything, the years of isolation and being labeled dangerous by his own community, the first love he pushed away because he could already sense the ending, the family secret that reached back into decades of falsified identity and violent criminal history, the relentless public scrutiny that followed every reading he gave, and the repeated surgeries that kept pulling him back from the edge of something permanent, what you find is not a story about gift or talent. What you find is a man who has spent nearly every year of his life learning to live with loss in its most unrelenting forms, and who has chosen, knowing everything it costs, to sit across from strangers and help them learn how to do the same.